Welcome to Justice Beyond the Bench, a podcast by the International Association of Women Judges. I'm Jane Charles Voltaire.
And I'm Amy Lewis. In this series, we spotlight women across the global justice sector who are leading efforts to advance gender equality, strengthen judicial systems, and champion inclusive leadership.
From courtrooms to communities, we'll hear powerful stories and unpack the strategies shaping women's leadership in law and the judiciary. It's time to go beyond the bench.
Today, we are joined by Sangeetha Yogendran, Senior Program Manager leading the Women Leaders in International Justice and Accountability at Asia Justice Coalition. Sangeetha is a lawyer and human rights and humanitarian professional and possesses more than a decade of experience on international legal research, advocacy, and program management.
She has worked on transitional justice issues and human rights issues in Cambodia and Sri Lanka, with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Singapore on international boundary issues, in the occupied Palestinian territories on humanitarian law violations, as well as with Rohingya refugee communities in Malaysia and in Australia.
Sangeetha also has extensive experience as a researcher on transitional justice, humanitarian assistance, rule of law, and business and human rights issues with various organizations focused on the Asia and ASEAN region, and has been deployed to support humanitarian responses in the Philippines, Nepal, Indonesia, and Bangladesh.
Today, we'll be diving deeper into one of Asia Justice Coalition's newest and most ambitious initiatives, the Women Leaders in International Justice and Accountability Project, a 3-year effort funded by the Co-Impact Gender Fund. This project is focused on strengthening women's leadership in international law by building expertise, fostering mentorship, and creating meaningful interventions in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka around migration and displacement, international criminal justice, and restorative or transitional justice. Welcome, Sangeetha, to Beyond the Bench, Asia Justice Coalition, Women Leaders in International Justice and Accountability. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, we're so excited to have you here today. So, maybe let's just start off by having you tell us a little bit more about the Asia Justice Coalition and what led to the launch of Women Leaders in International Justice and Accountability.
Thank you, Amy. I think that's a great starting point. So, the Asia Justice Coalition was founded in 2018 to establish effective coordination and collective action at the beginning regarding grave violations of international human rights and humanitarian law committed in Asia, with an initial focus on Myanmar. So, we are made up of 12 member organizations, and as a coalition, our purpose is to improve the legal landscape in Asia to ensure justice and accountability for gross violations of international human rights law and serious violations of humanitarian law as well. So the coalition operates through collaboration, resource sharing, and coordinating efforts between local and international civil society organizations specific to those working in the region. Our work is accomplished by undertaking joint activities relating to justice and accountability and engaging in collective advocacy. But since 2018, we've also become a standalone entity as the Asia Justice Coalition Secretariat. So we're a small team of 5 people. Together, we have taken on this new and large undertaking, which is the Women Leaders in International Justice and Accountability Project. Just for the sake of, preventing a mouthful every time I mention it, we've short-formed it to WEJA, if that helps. So the WEJA project is our large flagship project that we've undertaken as a secretariat. And there are several reasons for why we felt the need to do this, all of which I think would be quite apparent. But we recognize that there's so much expertise and knowledge in the region. And unfortunately, while there's quite a lot of improvement towards reaching gender equality in a lot of places and institutions, unfortunately, the higher up you go, you still find that a lot of legal institutions, especially that focus on justice and accountability, the percentage of female involvement and leadership tends to taper off the higher up you go.
So in many ways, I think what you're describing in terms of the need for this project and for Asia Justice Coalition overall in kind of uniting a series of organizations that can really identify needs within specific needs within the region and within the individual country context. You're talking a little bit about, again, the challenges with regards to women's leadership. Can you talk a little bit more about why it's important to specifically focus on building women's leadership within international law and justice, specifically within the South Asia region? And could you share some context about the pilot countries to help us better understand the landscape?
Sure. I think to start with, we identified three key problems that we wanted to address with the Ouija project. We identified that basically the development of women's expertise in international law is critical, not just in relation to, different types of practices of law, whether that's local or international, but also the particular language of the law. So we're hoping to have, by embarking on this project, a legal fluency that allows access to transnational networks, legal jurisdictions, and other sites of international politics and power. So we see this as self perpetuating. The more that women can access these sites of power, including international justice and accountability institutions, the more influence they can have. The more influence that women and women leaders can have in these sites of power, the more we see an inclusion of other women in the work that's being done. So, what we wanted to do was center the work of women practitioners and survivors in our design and intervention for the project. What we've hoped to do, or what we've hoped that we have done, is that through our coalition's own expertise in international justice and accountability, we recognize three distinct challenges that we think we were uniquely placed to address the problem. So, the first one, if I can get into the three, is the issue of gender disparity and harassment in legal practice. So, in order to undertake the project, we did some background research on some of the significant issues that practitioners face in the Asia region and also specifically in some of the country jurisdictions that we're working in, for example, Bangladesh. We realized, unfortunately, that even now, women legal practitioners across Asia still face significant challenges in legal practice, especially in domestic legal provisions. For example, according to the Bangladesh Legal Aid and Services Trust, they did a study in 2016 that showed that on average, 30% of legal academics are women, but only 10% of those in the legal profession in Bangladesh are female. So, according to BLAST, women lawyers often cited concerns ranging from physical and sexual harassment by male colleagues to facing patronizing and gender biased behavior from colleagues and clients to even something simple like basic lack of access to facilities, for example, female toilets for women in courtroom settings. Furthermore, I can reference a 2013 study from India that showed that in India, particularly, there was the second lowest rate of feminization or rate of growth for women in the legal sector out of more than 80 countries that were surveyed in this report. So, just like in Bangladesh, women practitioners in India also face sexual harassment and hostility, and similarly in Sri Lanka, even though women outnumber men in the legal profession, and despite women being in a minority in the workforce, the number of women in the legal profession was decreasing as the hierarchy of the court increased. Furthermore, and the last statistic for now, a 2020 Thomson Reuters report that actually charted the gender disparity between entry-level roles and senior roles in top firms found that in the Asia Pacific region, advancement to law firm leadership is often regarded as incompatible with women's tendency to shoulder a larger share of domestic responsibilities. So even now, we see this prevailing notion of a gendered assumption about what women's roles are, and we definitely think it's high time that we overcome some of these, you know, very patriarchal but also very outdated notions. That was the first issue that we wanted to overcome, that of gender disparity in legal practice. The second issue we wanted to overcome is that of what we've called the dual exclusivity of international law. Basically, what we're trying to say with that is that the gendered nature of international law tends to be made further exclusionary by the influence and centrality of the global north and its institutions and processes. So, As we know, international legal institutions have largely developed in the global north. They're largely situated in the global north. And therefore, the language around them would also be from the global north, even though global south matters necessitate litigation in a lot of situations. So we understand that given the difficulty faced by those practicing law and legal practitioners in domestic institutions, the barriers are therefore even greater for women wishing to practice in relation to international law. What more lead in the profession? So we found that this difficulty was even further compounded where women legal practitioners are from minority ethnic or religious backgrounds, or where women practitioners often have experienced the kinds of harm that are addressed by the very institutions they're hoping to get access to. So we wanted to try and break these cycles that seem to perpetuate in terms of institutions being global north and the language around them being very much situated in the global north. And lastly, the third reason why we wanted this project and why now is to counter this legacy of impunity that unfortunately we see in the Asia region. We've seen a lot of, unfortunately, compared to other regions in the world, there is still a lower level of engagement with the existing mechanisms of international justice and accountability, and a weak record of pursuing such accountability at not only the international levels, but at the regional levels. So, again, another reason and need for this in the Asia region was to try and counter this legacy of impunity and lack of engagement.
Thank you so much, Sangeetha. I think you focus on something that's really critical here and something that I think we haven't gotten a chance to talk a lot about on this podcast, and that is this notion of language and where it derives from, where it's situated, and how this contrast between the global north and the global south, and the way that the global north is centered, and how that kind of impacts the way that women are able to navigate these institutions or able to navigate international law, and the way that that kind of creates or contributes to this disparity as well. I know that the project also focuses on core themes of migration and displacement, international criminal justice mechanisms, and restorative or transitional justice. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about those and why those are your key focus areas and maybe how they play out specifically in your pilot countries like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka?
What we wanted to do was intentionally, we chose these three legal areas to also focus our systems mapping activities. So maybe if I can just briefly address how we wanted to come about with these interventions. So our whole project is designed on the basis of conducting needs assessment or systems assessments in the countries we wanted to work in. This is very much grounded by the fact that we don't want to come in and impose in any way what sort of interventions and projects and activities we should be doing. I think we were very, very mindful from the very get go that we do not want to be an organization that comes in with donor funding and tells a partner organization in a local jurisdiction what we thought they should be doing. We very much wanted to center what the partners and whoever we were engaging with, stakeholders across different sectors, were telling us was the need in the country. So what we did was, at least initially, to just narrow down. We focused on these broad areas for a few reasons. Mostly because they were core to the coalition's mandate, and they were also very key areas that were present in all the jurisdictions we wanted to target, and therefore were the most easily identifiable for a starting point. Of course, again, with the systems mapping exercises and the way we wanted to create the project, we were very open to these being very broad themes, and of course, responding to what would come out from our needs assessment and systems mapping exercises. So this was just a starting point. But the reason why we chose these is because, for example, a justice seeker first needs to ensure that their safety and security is secured before considering any engagement with an international legal process. So that's a reason why, for example, we focused on the rights of refugees, other displaced persons, and minority groups, knowing very well that they already would probably face even more hurdles and barriers in terms of engaging with international legal processes. In our partner's jurisdiction in Bangladesh, for example, we are well aware that they host a large population of Rohingya refugees as well. So it's a very pressing and day to day issue that the country is facing, communities are facing, and we didn't want a situation where we were talking to women practitioners and women leaders while excluding further marginalized groups within that. So that was, for example, one reason. Another reason was, for example, a justice seeker may not find international legal processes very representative of the harms they had suffered. So we wanted to look, while looking at international justice and accountability, also look at options for restorative or transitional justice, which is one of our other core areas that we're looking at. We recognize that a lot of times, whether from the leadership perspective or from the perspective of someone seeking justice, international law and justice processes can seem quite foreign. That was also a reason for why we wanted to focus on local practices where possible through, again, our systems mapping exercises. So, what we did was the conversations we had with partners, with stakeholders, and the resulting systems mapping exercises from each of these areas helped us understand and provide a more fuller, holistic understanding of the dynamics affecting access to justice and accountability. So, what we found interesting was that even though we had these three key legal areas, so rights for refugees and displaced persons and minorities, second, mechanisms related to international criminal justice, and third, restorative and transitional justice, a lot of the dynamics that affected participation and engagement with these processes were common and outside of these particular legal areas. That's where we were able to kind of ascertain what women leaders and practitioners were facing on a day to day basis in order to then access these three and work in these three key legal areas.
It's so interesting because I think what you're touching on right now is also how you approach this, right? And how you build ultimately real collaboration and I think sustainability in the sense of engagement that is true to the ways in which people are actually operating and not just with assumptions, right? Is really key. It's a shift in a dynamic ultimately, and a really beautiful way of thinking about how we have to, if we're really going to build these movements, kind of steer away from traditional ways that, in a sense, development, as we all know, has been really operating over the past few decades. I think for IWJ, that's really critical also in how we think in terms of engaging with our members and national associations in a way that's collaborative and that understands the perspective of those that are on the ground. So really commend you, I think, for leading in that way. You know, a strength, it seems, of this initiative, again, is collaboration with both local civil society, women-led groups, international partners. How do you envision that this network has been working well together or continues to work together in practice?
I think the essential success of this project and any similar work, I think, depends on this collaboration, right? With local civil society, women led groups, international actors, other local actors. So I think, and just to go back to your last point as well, respecting the level of experience and knowledge that is already there without coming in and supplementing it, because at the end of the day, we don't know better than the women leaders and the practitioners who have been doing this work for years and years and have so much
Mhm.
knowledge. I mean, I think respecting that, it was a very fundamental starting point for us. And I think for a lot of us to just come in with that and acknowledge that, you know, you already know what you need, what needs to be done. We are hopefully trying to facilitate that. So I think that's, in a way, a starting point for how we envision this network working together in practice. What we also tried to do with this collaboration was try and engage a cohort. Yeah, we call them our cohort of young to mid-level women leaders and practitioners from the very beginning and from the very start of this co-creation all the way until the end. So again, with the systems mapping exercises, what we did was work with our partners in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka to identify groups of about 20 to 30 mid to young level women practitioners and get them to engage with us in this exercise. So we actually, invited everyone and asked them to spare us 2 whole days while we actually really got into quite an in-depth systems mapping exercises. So we had flip charts out, we had lots of diagrams and drawings, and towards the end of the 2 days, we actually saw how some of these loops were coming back together. For example, if it was about access to spaces, for example, if someone had spoken about there's a lack of female toilets in a courtroom or nursing spaces for new mothers. That then came down to bigger points about access and then bigger issues about how women's participation in a lot of these processes needs to be respected as a starting point to then enable spaces to then reflect that as well. So, again, having this collaboration from the very beginning, I think helped us shape what our interventions ended up being. We're also hoping that what we've done is, the start of something bigger. So, in putting together this project, we are also aware that as much as we'd love to change the whole legal dynamic around this, we are targeting one particular part of this cycle by trying to develop this expertise and scholarship and opportunity for women leaders and practitioners in international law in the hopes that that then increases opportunities for them and opens up more and more spaces, especially for the next generations of leaders that are coming. What we also did was at the very beginning, along with setting up our systems mapping exercises, was that we established a project board made up of 12 senior women leaders and practitioners from the Asia region specifically. So, almost like an advisory board, and not specific to AJC, but specific to the Ouija project. They kind of served as our compass, if you will, having bringing in all these years of seniority and experience. A lot of them have worked in domestic situations, a lot of them work in international legal institutions. They were kind of like our northern light, if you will, guiding us from the senior perspective about what, you know, some of these interventions and some of our work could look like. And I think it was so helpful having this mixing of younger and mid-level practitioners through our systems mapping exercises and our cohorts with our partner organizations, and then this senior group of women leaders sitting on our project board. So another thing that was very important to us was not to only engage with either end of the spectrum. We didn't want to engage with only senior practitioners who can very valuably speak to their experience, but from that perspective. But that could have potentially excluded what young practitioners, especially those coming into the field, might be facing as a result. So we hope that by working together with these different groups, just even within the project and the project design, we had this network coming together to then guide us on, where our interventions could go.
That's a really, really strong and important point. When we think about how we work with systems, how we work with women, and especially for those of us that may be coming from the global north or coming from the west, and thinking about like what does it really look like to engage locally? How do you establish that? How do you set that up? Even here at IAWJ, when we are working in our Women in Leadership and Law pilot countries, we have a similar setup where we have what we call a technical committee, and we have on the ground judicial coordinators and drawing really, like you say, on that local expertise, but also trying to have that intergenerational dialogue, right? And I think a lot of times in the legal profession, we can see that hierarchy replicated outside the courts, outside of firms. And I think the more that we can kind of get women to engage with each other across the spectrum, as you say, the richer the dialogue, the richer the experience, the richer the interventions are going to be, right? Because women are not a monolith, we know that, and we need to think about what they're experiencing at all levels of their life, at all points in which they practice. And I really love what you have to say about this systems mapping and really respecting the level of experience and knowledge that's already there. As you say, we don't know better than the women leaders already doing the work. And how can we really, take our technical expertise, maybe take our knowledge from what we know of these broader international systems and help to co-create or co-design these interventions that will really have lasting systemic changes. And I think one thing that we have been really thinking critically about and talking about is how do we measure this? How do we really start to show, to donors, to outsiders, like that we are moving the needle, that we're having some metric of success. And of course, there's long term outcomes, of like increasing the numbers and having those like more quantitative metrics. But what do you at AJC or what do you think, Sangeetha, about like what does meaningful impact actually look like at the end, especially for
Yeah.
this project? And ultimately, what do you hope that the legacy of the Women Leaders in International Justice and Accountability Project will have?
I think that's a great question because it is actually something we've had to think about from the beginning, but also now, as we're in our third and final year of the project, in terms of how we measure success, but also what it means to us. Because I think, unlike traditional situations where you would maybe measure success by saying X number of people attended a training, we have therefore influenced this number of women leaders in being able to increase their knowledge of international law or being able to give them access to some of these spaces. I think for us, it's a lot more nuanced than that. But I think that's where the strength of the project is. For example, I think, the fact that we now have these two cohorts in both our partner countries with our partner organizations is a huge strength in itself. We have tried our best to engage with them as much as possible throughout the process. So, not just at the beginning with the systems mapping exercise, but we've kept consulting with them where possible. We, in both cases, in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, after the systems mapping exercise, actually came back a few months later to go over some of the findings and some of our takeaways just to make sure and check in with the cohort. Wait a minute, is what we are saying that we find as takeaways, does this resonate with you? Is this reflective of the conversations you had when everyone was together in the room for a few days? So we wanted to make sure that, we didn't just consult with a cohort and then take the systems maps away and then just go, okay, this is what we want to do. Anyway, we'll make it fit within this, consultation exercise, for example. Um, so I think the success in a way is that our interventions have very much come out of what was talked about and what was discussed in the systems mapping exercises. From some of the loops, we made it a point to make sure that we could draw our interventions back to the very loops that we came up with during the exercises. And I think that is, for example, a measure of success. Maybe that's not really something we can put down easily on paper sometimes, but for us, that's a measure of success. I think the interventions themselves are where we see some of this success building. And maybe if I can talk a little bit about the interventions here. For example, in Sri Lanka, we had very interesting discussions with our cohorts. And a lot of it pointed back to the fact that, there's still a lot of disparity in the legal profession within the country. So speaking from a quite domestic point of view, while acknowledging that through the legal profession, many practitioners in Sri Lanka are engaging with international processes, international institutions. Lots of women practitioners we spoke to, they engage with UN mechanisms. They, are engaged with the Human Rights Council, for example. So we saw this come up time and time again in the systems mapping exercises and in the follow up that the gender disparity in the senior legal positions of the local system um, are still quite a pressing problem and issue. And unfortunately, even though half of the law students and graduates every year are women, and half of those who enter the legal profession every year are also women, still a small fraction of these women were advancing into the highest ranks of the profession. So the question kept bugging everyone. Why is it that only so few women were getting to the top of the legal profession? And why were only so few women finding places on the bench in Sri Lanka? So this kept coming up during our systems mapping, even though we were talking about issues related to the rights of refugees, displaced persons, minorities, and mechanisms connected to international criminal justice. So a key insight that kept being raised was that these systemic challenges cannot be fully addressed because women, particularly those with lived experience, do not remain in the field long enough to be able to do something, substantive at the higher levels. So, a lot of our participants in Sri Lanka, for example, observed that the legal profession in particular was just unsustainable for women. And that was then leading to perhaps the exclusion. A lot of issues affecting women was being affected by the fact that this representation was not being seen higher up. So it was said by quite a few participants that a range of deep rooted systemic barriers were hindering women's retention and advancement within the legal profession. So, this professional exclusivity, if you will, and the limited diversity in the leadership, and of course, as well, the absence of well being and support mechanisms were all contributing to an environment that were pushing women out. And it was also noted that harassment lies at the center of why many women lawyers were undermined in their professional undertaking. So, as a result of these conversations that we had in the systems mapping exercises, what the intervention in Sri Lanka is looking at what an anonymous reporting mechanism for sexual harassment would look like in the legal field in Sri Lanka. So, we are very much at the starting point of it, and unfortunately we don't have the benefit of time, to really build on this, and we hope we will. We hope this is just the beginning. But our team and our partners have basically conducted interviews and surveys with more than 100 practitioners anonymously about the nature and impact of the harassment faced by female lawyers all over Sri Lanka, whether it's individuals who are still practicing or those who have left the profession. And with the report, we hope to understand how harassment has affected the professional but also personal lives of women, with the view to what an anonymous reporting mechanism could look like in Sri Lanka to hopefully counter what is unfortunately still prevalent harassment in the field. So, again, for example, I think that's just one way that we would measure success is that we can take the report and the findings of it and share it with partner organizations, share it with the bar association, hopefully, and work together to build what might be a full functioning mechanism in, I hope, a couple of years that would then directly tackle harassment in legal practice.
You know, Sangeetha, I think you're touching on some really key points that I want to highlight. One, and that's a really wonderful way of kind of approaching things, which is an iterative process, right? Where you're not just taking, your kind of initial needs assessment and then just only running with that. You're actually going back to the conversation to check with those that you're engaging with to ensure ultimately, right, that you're still on the path and that you're building off of what were the initial assumptions, but that these things don't just happen kind of in a straight line, right? You're finding out new things as you're implementing projects. And that's really key, to understand that success in these projects also depends on recognizing this iterative process ultimately. And
Exactly.
two, I think what you kind of highlighted in terms of the experience in Sri Lanka is something certainly that IWJ has also found in so many of the pilot countries that we're working through in our Women in Leadership and Law initiative. The challenge with regards to women's advancement in the legal profession and specifically for us, we look at the bench, the prevalence of sexual harassment, unfortunately. And I think it's really key that you were able to kind of make this link, right? In terms of representation and ultimately access with regards to these international processes with this link of, why were women, despite the numbers with regards to women lawyers and women accessing law school not measuring up. And part of that is that environment, right? That
Exactly.
hostile environment continues to be a challenge for so many women legal practitioners around the world. So, we wish you also the best of kind of success as you're trying to kind of draw this all out and understanding that, yes, hopefully your report and the ongoing work that you're doing here will continue to have, shed some light on these critical ways in which women are excluded essentially, or in which an environment is created that really undermines women's desire to enter into this profession.
And I think you also touched on, Sangeetha, another really important point, and that is that these systems ultimately weren't and aren't designed for women, all the way to not even considering biological needs and having access
Hmm.
to toilets in a courthouse through what really is in the water, and we talk a lot about like what does institutional or systemic change really look like and how can we manifest that, and it really is getting to what you described as these deep rooted systemic barriers that are hindering advancement. It's in the system, it's in the fabric, and women just weren't considered, and now it's like, how do we redesign and create systems, legal systems, justice systems that work for everyone, and we're not just retroactively trying to fit women in to this paradigm that doesn't really work for anyone.
Exactly. And I think it's just so important to acknowledge that. I mean, it's unfortunate that we're still talking about these things in 2025, that it's down to as simple as having spaces that are accessible. But I think we saw the connection with being able to address things in a domestic, local setting and how that could potentially open up, spaces and opportunities and access to leadership and opportunities for practitioners to get to international justice institutions as well. So I think even though the whole project is about international justice and accountability, it's actually really important that we didn't exclude what was going on in domestic practice as well, because we've seen through our systems mapping exercises and speaking with, stakeholders and our cohorts, how interconnected the two are, and how, it was quite telling that if you're not even fully able to access and thrive in a domestic legal practice setting, what more getting into the international justice and accountability space?
So you told us a little bit about what the work that you're doing in Sri Lanka. Can you also maybe share with us a little bit about what you've discovered or what you're doing in Bangladesh as well?
Absolutely. I think, I've been dying for the chance to also speak about Bangladesh because our partners have been doing such wonderful work. And I think it's very important for me to acknowledge that, as AJC running this project, none of this would have been possible without the amazing partners we've had. So in Bangladesh, it's been the Center for Peace and Justice at Brack University. And in Sri Lanka, it's been the Women's Education and Research Center, who've all just been amazing. We've had country coordinators working directly with us on this project. And, their teams have just done amazing things with very limited resources and in both cases, some crazy political developments that have, meant that things had to come to a standstill. I'm sorry, this is not immediately addressing the question, and I will get to it. But just to acknowledge that, both Sri Lanka and Bangladesh had quite difficult times, especially last year with Bangladesh seeing the whole government being overthrown, basically a revolution. Things had to be paused for a while. And, our team and our partners basic safety and security was of the utmost importance for a while. So, as much as it's a drive to always try and get as much done in the amount of time any project has, it's very important to not let that be the dominating force in a situation where you need to make sure that everyone is just okay and safe. And fortunately, our partners have worked really hard to make up for any loss of time that either Sri Lanka and Bangladesh saw with political instability and, election and the potential of violence in Sri Lanka as well. So, kudos to our amazing partners for getting anything done given the circumstances. But yes, so in Bangladesh, it was really interesting through our systems mapping exercise that we found that there was just a lot of lack of knowledge and awareness around what was already present in the Bangladeshi legal system, both from the domestic side of things and the international side of things. So, a lot of the conversations focused, even though we had our three key legal areas, a lot of it focused on the rights for refugees and displaced persons and other minorities, given the substantial size of the Rohingya population in Bangladesh and our partners' existing wonderful work with the communities in the camps in Cox's Bazar. So a lot of the conversation was about how can we improve the rights and opportunities for these displaced people and other minority groups in the country, because Bangladesh has a lot of minority groups that do not necessarily get the same representation always. And we all thought, sitting in the room, that, it was probably due to a lack of legal laws and policies in place, and that's why you know there was this exclusion of refugee and minority groups. Interestingly, we then, went and did further research. And when we came back for our follow-up meeting after the systems mapping exercise, we actually realized that there were lots of laws and policies in place within the system. And it was just something that, everyone was not so aware of. So then a conversation shifted from trying to, address how to change the system itself to being more like, hey, let's use what is actually already there. It's a very strong set of laws and policies that could actually help increase awareness and increase advocacy for these groups of people, especially for women in these refugee and displaced and minority groups, because acknowledging that there's like a double, maybe triple, you know, triple harm and negativity when you're already a displaced person and then you're also a woman and then maybe from further minority groups, it just compounds, right? Our interventions then focused on trying to use the existing laws and policies. And what our partners have done is actually consult with multiple groups of refugees, minority groups, and other displaced people across the country. So the team went everywhere, as much as possible, and held consultations with various groups, including plainland ethnic minorities, um, the practitioners who work on ethnic minority groups and on with refugee groups, and conducted discussions on the role of domestic and international laws and mechanisms that were already there protecting these rights, what some of the gendered aspects in these contexts were, and what kind of support the practitioners needed in being able to further support the communities they were already working with. So, what we are now actually putting together is a whole series of practitioner notes, which is designed to increase practitioners' existing ability to use the laws and provisions and policies that are already there to further include and increase the inclusivity for ethnic minority needs and rights. So, what we've done is coming from the initial discussion about not being aware of what laws and policies were, which would then, what we thought was in, that was leading to the exclusion of refugees and ethnic minority groups from discussions on international justice and accountability, to then actually using what was already in place to come up with guidelines and what we felt is a very practical tool in the form of these practitioner notes to be able to further enable those already working in this space to do even more with what is already in place in the country. So not trying to, change things and shake things up completely, because how realistic might that have been if we wanted to go in and change laws and policies altogether? And then realizing, wait, actually, there's such a great strength of work already in place and trying to utilize that. So that was one of the um, interventions that we have in Bangladesh. And the second one, which I think is personally just so interesting, is in trying to think about how domestic cases and the legal system, how that's presented. We realized that a lot of times there was just a lack of looking at things from a feminist lens. And what would that look like if, for example, court cases and court judgments were rewritten with a feminist lens? So our second intervention in Bangladesh is actually a feminist rewriting judgments project, where we've had working groups along with our partner organization take different cases and try and reimagine and rewrite them from a feminist lens. And I think, that's been so interesting because it hasn't necessarily been focusing on cases that have to do with, women or women's issues, again, whatever you want to call that, but it's more looking at other cases, for example, the issuance of a fatwa in Bangladesh, or land rights, or all these, very broad issues that affect everyone, and trying to rewrite some of these things from a feminist lens. And so we formed little working groups, and each group worked on one particular case. And we matched younger practitioners with a more senior practitioner or academic. And each working group then put together a rewritten case or judgment. And the idea, of course, is not to, tell judges how they should be doing things. Obviously not. A lot of times, the the ultimate outcome of the case wasn't necessarily different, but there's a lot more nuance and things that were taken into account from a feminist lens, which were not thought of before. So we hope that by putting this set of judgments out, which we hope to do in the next few months, will be a way of thinking about how the legal system, even down to the way judgments are written, can be more inclusive and from a feminist lens.
What a fascinating, I think, approach, and something that we've certainly heard even our own members and national associations talk about with regards to feminist rewriting of judgments and understanding how essentially the bias of language in within those judgments, even for all kinds of cases, as you say, right? From land rights, healthcare, parental rights, et cetera, and how fascinating that is. And again, really commend you for talking about and accentuating this intergenerational work and engagement, which is really key. I think if we want to think about systems, unfortunately, within often the legal world that can be quite hierarchical. And I think that's been probably really key to your success also is this intergenerational work. So really want to commend you for that and thank you for sharing on what you're doing, the incredible work that you're doing in Bangladesh and of course as well in Sri Lanka and giving us that context as well of the politics and how can't say enough, and having worked in many different contexts, how important it is to think about the people on the ground, in whatever you're doing. The work is important, but of course, the people, are more important, and making
Mhm.
sure that your people are okay is really key always in any of the engagement that we do. So, we're coming to a close and want to ask you a question that we ask all of our guests. What do you think, in one word, will have the greatest impact on advancing women's leadership in law?
I would say, if I had to narrow it down to one word, access. Because I think what I mean by access is access to opportunities, access to spaces, access to institutions. Um, for me, why I chose access is because I think women leaders and women practitioners, whether from Asia or any part of the world, already have everything you would need to be leading any institution or leading the international field. There's all the lived reality, there's all the experience, there's all the qualifications. So I think it's just about allowing these amazing women and professionals the opportunity to get into these spaces. So for me, it's just about access because I don't think it should be on women leaders to need to further prove themselves and do more than they're already doing and take on more because, I think that's further putting the burden on women practitioners and leaders when it's more about hopefully having spaces and fields that are open to welcoming women leaders and practitioners and not just in the lower levels and the more junior roles, but all the way up to the top. And I think that's what's really important because there are so many wonderful women leaders and practitioners with all the experience. And a lot of them are doing amazing work in their own settings, whether it's domestically or internationally. And maybe we just need to see that reflected in some of these institutions that, you know, govern the international justice and accountability space.
Access is great. Thank you for sharing that. And completely agree that let's not put the burden on women. They need is a pathway, and access is a perfect way of describing that. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sangeetha. It's been such a wonderful conversation. I think the way that you've shared some of these concrete examples is just so powerful. And, for our listeners thinking about what does it look like to design interventions and what are some of the possibilities. And I think you've given us a lot to think about and a lot of really powerful ideas of how we can navigate this in other contexts as well. And what we've heard today is that Asia Justice Coalition's Women Leaders in International Justice and Accountability Project is more than just a program. It's a blueprint for systemic change. By mentoring emerging women practitioners, mapping barriers with women led organizations, creating space and access for women, and designing interventions rooted in real needs. AJC is creating pathways for women to lead and for communities to access justice in meaningful ways. And it's also a reminder that justice doesn't just exist in the abstract, it's deeply connected to the local, lived experiences of people and communities seeking accountability. Thank you for tuning into Justice Beyond the Bench. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Want to learn more about our work and support our mission? Visit us at iawj.org, where you can explore our programs, join our global network, or make a donation to help advance gender equity in judiciaries around the world. See you next time.